The Swampers were a group of musicians in Muscle Shoals. Barry Beckett on keyboard, Roger Hawkins on drums, David Hood on bass, and Jimmy Johnson on guitar. And of course, there were players before them and after them, and players that worked with them, but the nucleus were those four guys who were known as the Swampers. And in that studio, many hit records were recorded. Cher, the Rolling Stones did Brown Sugar and Wild Horses in that studio. Bob Dylan came down and recorded a couple albums, went on with Slow Train Coming, You Gotta Serve Somebody. Bob Seger did a lot of his records there at Muscle Shoals Sound. Their first big record with Bob Seger was that Old Time Rock and Roll. That song was written by one of their staff writers, and they made a demo of that song. They thought it was going to be, they thought it was a weak song, so they made it the first song they recorded that day to get it out of the way so they could get to some good songs. And a side story to that was that after they got through recording that song, the musicians had left except for Jimmy Johnson, who was also producing it. And he turned around and a young guy had walked in the back door of the studio, and he was standing there uninvited, unannounced. And after a minute, Jimmy turned around and said, "Can I help you?" And the kid was very sure of himself, and he said, I want to cut a record. I want to play on a record. And Jimmy said, "Well, what do you play?" He says, "I play guitar." He says, "Well, do you have a guitar?" And he says, "Yeah, it's out in the car." He says, "Well, go get your guitar." So the kid went out to the car and got his guitar out. His parents were sitting out there. I think they had Texas tags. His name was Howie McDonald. He's changed his first name to something else now, but then it was Howie McDonald, 16, 17 years old. The first song on the demo tape was that Old Time Rock and Roll. It was cut on 2-inch tape, so they had empty tracks that you could record on. So Jimmy had the engineer back it all the way up and let Howie plug into one of the amps and play along with it. Well, to Jimmy's surprise, he said the kid could play. So he let him play all the way through the song on an empty track, and he left. They sent the demo to Bob Seger. Bob Seger played the song live in Europe. The second time the chorus came around, the young kids in the crowd were standing up in their chairs singing it. They knew they had to get back and record it. They came back and tried to record it, but could not match the feel of the original demo. They spent about $40,000 in late 70s, which was a good bit of money then, trying to recreate that song, and they just couldn't do it. So they asked Jimmy if they could use the tracks that the Swampers had cut and overdub Bob Seger's voice and some saxophone and other things, which they did. So they sent him a copy of the 2-inch tape. And when the record came out, it was a big hit. Howie McDonald called Jimmy Johnson and said, "Hey, do I get paid and do I get a gold record?" And Jimmy said, "Oh my gosh, I forgot to tell him that Howie was on an empty track," and they actually mixed him into the record. So the first record this kid, and maybe the only record this kid ever played on, was that Old Time Rock and Roll, one of the biggest songs of all time. And yes, he got paid scale, and yes, he got a gold record. And to this day, he still plays. And on the top of his resume, it says, "Played guitar on that Old Time Rock and Roll." That's a great music industry story, and it's 100% true. Behind me here is the original number sheet that David Hood wrote out for Still Crazy after all these years for Paul Simon. Paul came down to cut one song. He heard a record that they had done, they being the Swampers had done on somebody. It had kind of a reggae sound, and so he came down and wanted to cut one song with them, and they cut it in like 2 or 3 takes. It was done, and he was crazy about it. And he had the studio booked for a week. And so, unlike, he was used to spending a week on it in New York with other players, whatever. He didn't know what to do, so he started playing. He sat on the middle of the floor of the studio and started playing them songs, and he played them this song, Crotochrome, and they listened to it. They said, hey, let's try that Crotochrome song. So they did that. They did Love Me Like a Rock. They did many, many great records for Paul Simon. They're the musicians that Ahmet Ertegun used on the Aretha Franklin records. They brought Aretha down to record with them. Ahmet Ertegun and Atlantic Records found out about these musicians and these studios down in Muscle Shoals through their connection with Stax Records in Memphis. And that's how they got connected with the Rolling Stones and Aretha Franklin, is through Ahmet Ertegun and the Atlantic connection. Bob Dylan. They would bring all of these great vocalists, great groups down there to get some of that magic that was evidently in the water in Muscle Shoals. Like the Memphis horns at Stax, Muscle Shoals had the Muscle Shoals horn section. Harvey Thompson, Ronnie Eads, Harrison Calloway, and not in the picture is Charles Rhodes.
Down to the ground when he tried to get up, life would kick him back down. One day, Papa called me to his dying bed, put his hands on my shoulder, then in tears he said, Patches, I'm depending on your son.